The Spanish-American War is unlike other wars that we've looked at in a couple ways. First of all, it was very short. The duration was April to August 1898, a little under 4 months. Also, it was fought in neither Spain nor America. This indicates that it was really an imperial quest of a war. And it isn't fair or accurate to say that it was caused by false reports on the front page of sales-driven newspapers. But it was the first war where yellow journalism, or what today might refer to as fake news, really did play a significant role in helping to shape American foreign policy. And we'll turn to that next time. Now, the war was fought for a few reasons. One, a genuinely humanitarian impulse to save the Cubans from an oppressive Spanish imperial rule. Mostly, though, and wrapped into the first, the cause was territorial acquisition and the establishment of an American imperium, or a dominion over the seas, imperial dominion. Now, to understand something about this war and about how it responded to, embodied, and helped to shape the development of the American mythos, we need to look a little at the national context before we turn to the war proper. So here, first, we'll look at the myth of the frontier and at the role of immigration in late 19th century American self-understanding. First, the frontier. What we have here is a book by Richard Slotkin, Gunfighter Nation. I recommend it to you. It's a book in which Slotkin argues that the myth of the frontier is our oldest and most characteristic myth, that it drove the establishment and development of the colonies, that it drove westward expansion and manifest destiny, and that while its contours have changed, it still, this myth still lives in the minds and the values of individual Americans, and it still organizes our collective national efforts towards one or another goal. Now, later in history, after the era of the Spanish-American War, we see this myth of the frontier show up, both in Roosevelt and in Kennedy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, called the nation to battle on the frontier of want and fear to conquer those forever. And Kennedy ran his campaign on this notion of the new frontier, space, that final frontier of Star Trek, but also housing for all, health insurance for the elderly, economic and civil rights for Latin and African Americans. And this quote really encapsulates it. We stand here today at the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 60s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. The new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges. Now, that's a sort of repackaged version of the same old thing, in that the frontier had from its beginnings as an American myth involved challenges. It was always wrapped up with that, with struggle. So, new version of the same old. But the myth of the frontier, though it appears throughout history a number of times, can be pinned most directly to the historical period between the Civil War and World War I, the period that encompasses the Spanish-American War that we're looking at today. Now, in 1893, at the Chicago World's Fair, which also hosted the first World's Parliament of Religions, for the first time, this is what you see in the bottom left, for the first time bringing religious and cultural others to a public stage to speak on their own behalf. And a number of figures were introduced at this moment, as well as the traditions they were called to represent, and really captured the minds and imaginations and curiosity of Americans who hadn't had access to traditions of the so-called East very much at all before this point, certainly not from their own perspective. So Shakyu Soyan, Dharmapala, Vivekananda all spoke, all were presented here, and all really captured American imagination, Vivekananda especially. It's worth noting that this parliament was run, though it was diversity kind of personified in a new way, it was run and organized under the umbrella of a very Protestant Christianity. So there's that. It's an interesting story worth looking into. But notably, for our purposes here, bottom right, Native Americans were not represented at the World Parliament of Religions, though they were represented at the fair. They appeared in exhibits, sort of living exhibits, diorama-style exhibits, in the midway, or the carnival section of the World's Fair, near the first Ferris wheel ever. Primarily for entertainment purposes. What you see at the upper right is the city that was built to host this World's Fair, that was built out of temporary materials burning to the ground. This happened, it was at the time, it's a fascinating story and worth looking into. At the time, we were in a recession. The nation was in a recession. After the fair closed, the buildings established for it, grand buildings, were primarily homeless shelters, homeless encampments, and a massive fire raged through Chicago and burnt the entire thing to the ground. But again, what we're focusing on here is, really how this moment crystallized an American ethos and the treatment of Native Americans in the, in a strictly entertainment, extraordinarily condescending way. This is characteristic of even the most so-called progressive American practices at the time. At the World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago, American historian Frederick Jackson Turner presented a paper titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And this came to be known as the Frontier Thesis, and it remains an object of criticism and engagement today. His claim was that a distinctly new American identity was born not in colonial New England, not in revolutionary times, but rather in the experience of successive generations moving westward and finding ways to survive on an expansive geography of relative wildness. Mostly ignoring questions of race or gender, he claimed that the material and economic conditions of the West were the essential determinative factors in building what, by his time, had come to be understood as the American character. All the paintings here that you see are by another Frederick Remington, and we will come back to him as well. Now, that American character, that new American character built on the frontier, was ruggedly individualistic. It had a coarseness and a strength about it, had a restless, nervous energy, and also a sense of acquisitiveness. Because individuals and families had to work hard to establish a foothold, feed themselves, educate their children, communities formed on newly democratic, egalitarian models. Class divisions, institutions, and cultural artifacts of the so-called Old World were increasingly out of place here on this American frontier. What Turner didn't talk about, what Americans have only really begun to acknowledge, is that this frontier was also built on genocide. Now, what Turner saw in 1893 was a point of crisis brought about by the closing of the frontier. This is a census map from 1890, and in that year, 1890, the Census Bureau had declared the closing of the frontier, had for the first time in the development of the nation, had said that there is no continuous frontier line, no open space left unknown for colonialists to discover and take. And you see that though there is a great deal of unpopulated land in the west, the western border along the Pacific is pretty thoroughly populated. And America had not yet found a new frontier at this point, hadn't yet culturally figured out how it was going to channel that rugged individualistic energy. So Turner called for, or noticed the beginnings of, what he called the exchange of an old domestic agrarian frontier for a new frontier of world power and industrial development. Through this exchange, the exchange for sort of land for industry, through this exchange, the character that was built on the frontier, a character that values struggle, privileges hardship, individuality, determination, resilience, might find an outlet and thereby circumvent the crisis by turning it in another direction. Whether or not it could do so without the genocidal practices or colonial hubris that had built the agrarian frontier is another question and sort of remains open. But if the Mexican-American War's myth of and realization of manifest destiny made the frontier a geographically open and even central part of American identity, then the Spanish-American War is representative of an era in which that frontier became a defining symbol. If the Mexican-American War opened the physical frontier for national conquest, then the Spanish-American War carried that symbol over oceans. The new frontier was global. It was the establishment of an American imperium. Among the most emblematic figures of the frontiersmen is Theodore Roosevelt, 26th president. Born and raised in New York, he nonetheless imbibed that frontier spirit. Time enough had passed since the first waves of pioneers had made their way west that a literary and visual mythos of the frontier had been established even for the children of New York gentry, which he was. Roosevelt struggled in his life like all people do. He had life-threatening asthma as a kid. Both his mother and his wife died within hours of each other, 2 days after his first child was born. But the color of his skin, the amount of money he had available to him, the amount of resources he had at his disposal, those were never a struggle for Roosevelt. They were never in question. He was a rich white male. He did question and seek to change a great deal in America, was progressive in many ways that would still be considered progressive today. But he didn't question genocide. He didn't question racism. He didn't question the privilege of whiteness. And for that, he's being revisited today. From our historical vantage, it's pretty easy to judge him and maybe even condemn him. He was a racist by today's standards, unquestionably. He was into eugenics. On Native Americans, he's almost entirely indefensible. He said, the most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian. He wanted, for Native Americans, complete and total assimilation into an American individualism. He wanted tribal communities to be absolutely eradicated in the interest of building more individualized, industrially minded workers on the Anglo-American model. And he was an imperialist. He believed, he was a true believer in the white man's burden, what was called the white man's burden. We'll turn back to that. That it was the role of Anglo-Europeans, but especially of Anglo-Americans, to care for and uplift all other races, all other ethnic groups. As historian Tim Stanley writes, he embodied his generation's thirst for power and its contempt for other races. And he did. To understand the role that Theodore Roosevelt plays in the development of the American mythos, to understand how he made it onto Mount Rushmore and how he continues to be ranked by historians as one of the very best of America's presidents, we also have to understand that in his own time, he was an extraordinarily progressive voice. He was born in 1858, died in 1919. He was a member, as we've said, of the New York gentry, but he was also a cowboy. He spent years cattle ranching in the Dakotas, during which time he developed the view of Native Americans that I quoted earlier. He was a conservationist. He established the U.S. Forest Service, 5 national parks, 150 national forests, 121 national reserves, persistently removing native tribes in order to do it. He was a naturalist, and he wrote his first naturalist study at age 9, and later took an expedition to Africa to hunt big game. That expedition shot and killed over 11,000 animals. Later, he went to South America, same deal. The animals were stuffed and sent back to the Smithsonian and other American museums, and responding to criticism of this just wanton, slaughter, Roosevelt said, "I can be condemned only if the existence of the National Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, and all similar zoological institutions are to be condemned." Now, New York's Museum of Natural History has opted to take down this statue of Roosevelt because of its, quote, racially condescending composition. You can see Roosevelt riding, grandly on a horse, and next to him walk a Native American and an African American. As a nation, we're reckoning with race. We see this as, condescending and, if only tacitly, definitely, embodying a kind of white supremacy. In Roosevelt's era, it was its own difficulty in that the Native American and the African American pictured are walking with their shoulders back, and to some degree, in consort with this man. Many thought that was too great a role for these folks to play. Now, like I said, as a nation, we're reckoning with race. We're coming to a new understanding of ourselves. I think we're learning things. I have great hope that we're getting better. But what we've not reckoned with, and what I think looking at Theodore Roosevelt can help us to reckon with, really looking at him, looking at his figure and his role, is this thirst for power. This thirst for power that was an enormous part of the American consciousness and still remains one. Part of it, big game for education, which we can now see, sort of endangered animals slaughtered, strikes us as inherently somehow problematic, if not outright wrong. But today, this thirst for power also shows up. A really nationalistic American sense of thirst for power shows up in our, in our assumption of the God-given right to cheap gas or to, six kinds of every consumer good. We've not reckoned with that. He was also a New York State Assemblyman, and here's his progressiveness. He was against government and corporate corruption, against civil service sinecures, which is, jobs. It means without care. So, jobs where you got the job, you got your salary, but you didn't work. He was against those and reformed them through his work in the U.S. Civil Service Commission. He was against police corruption as the New York Police Commissioner. He was pro-labor. As a president, he was the first president to get involved in labor disputes and to do so on the side of labor. The quote here, "It is essential that there should be an organization of labor. This is an era of organization. Capital organizes, and therefore labor must organize." He lobbied for a federally regulated 8-hour workday. That wouldn't happen until 1940. He called for a peacetime federal income tax. That happened with the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913. And for an inheritance tax, happened in 1916. And he lobbied for campaign reform. This quote, I again recommend a law prohibiting all corporations from contributing to the campaign expenses of any party. Let individuals contribute as they desire, but let us prohibit in effective fashion all corporations from making contributions for any political purpose, directly or indirectly. He tried to ban corporate political contributions, and we know that this remains a desperate problem today, and far more so than when he was in office. Running in 1912 as a progressive third-party candidate, he said this: "To destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, is the first task of the statesmanship of the day. This country belongs to the people. Its resources, its businesses, its laws, its institutions should be utilized, maintained, or altered in whatever manner will best promote the general interest." He wasn't just a politician, he was also a prolific author. He wrote a ton of books, including this, The Winning of the West, Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, The New Nationalism, The Rough Riders, The Strenuous Life, American Ideals, American Big Game Hunting, and on and on and on. He wrote and wrote and wrote. In his life, he was extraordinarily active, more than most of our models that we see. And he was all about the rugged individual, all about the frontiersman with all of its problematic aspects. He believed with Turner that a new American race, a new ethnic group, a new ethnic category had emerged from the frontier. Tough, able, rough and ready, manliness, manifesting manliness, which to him meant bravery and strength, a real physicalized and martial sense of manliness. That frontier, the conquering of which was, remember, the manifest destiny of the nation, it was required, as John O'Sullivan wrote, for space to accommodate our yearly multiplying millions. And during this time especially, those millions were multiplying at an unprecedented rate, a rate that hasn't been seen since. Bottom right, you see immigration in straight numbers, right? We've only recently just passed the numbers during Roosevelt's time, but in terms of percentages, we're not quite there yet. So this is really unprecedented immigration. As you read, in conjunction with these record high immigration numbers and in conjunction also with the closing of the physical frontier, the late 19th century saw a whole grip of new legislative restrictions placed on immigration. 1882's Chinese Exclusion Act, perhaps the most clearly and ethnically delineated, was only one of them, only one such restriction. Now, one thing that it has going for it is that it was clearly and honestly named, the Chinese Exclusion Act. There's no pretense here, right? Unlike 2017's Executive Order 13769, titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States, which detractors refer to as the Muslim ban, and pretty effectively was that, there was no pretense here about what was going on, and no cultural sense that there needed to be pretense. Political cartoons all over the country supported this act. Chinese workers were understood to be taking jobs, and you see the Working Men's Party of California was also against Chinese immigration. They were understood to be both taking jobs and changing the culture. The Chinese Exclusion Act was one of many measures during the time attempting to limit immigration. During a time when immigrants increasingly came from Eastern Europe and Asia, the one on the upper left, represents this Eastern European immigration, the high tide of immigration. It's captioned a national menace, right? And what you see is like riffraff immigration, people sort of, coming up, and Uncle Sam there is danger to American ideals and institutions, just trying to get away from the wave, right? That was not an uncommon viewpoint, right? And on the bottom right, another problem with these new immigrants is a lot of them were Catholic, right? And so what we see in the bottom is that represented the American River Ganges. By the way, America did not know what the River Ganges was in terms of any real religious context for Hinduism or the spiritual traditions of India. It knew that it was far away, other, very foreign, and that's what it's aiming at represented here. And you see that the alligators, or crocodiles, coming up through the water and threatening all these poor, scared white children, Anglo-European, Western European, ostensibly Protestant children, that those crocodiles are wearing cardinals' hats. That they're very clearly, they've got crosses on their back. These are Catholics. This is the force of Catholicism. And if you can see a fort in the back trying to defend these poor white Protestants from this aggressive Catholic attack, its flag is upside down. That's in the flag code a symbol of distress. So there really was, and these were a couple of the many political cartoons appearing at the time that represented a kind of anxiety in the American populace that these new immigrants weren't from that hardy stock of Western Europeans that Roosevelt and others believed had created a new race of rugged frontiersmanship, that they were somehow other and not good. So in the late 19th century, focal points of American self-understanding are the frontier and immigration. Anti-immigration laws were enacted, but the notion of the melting pot was also there, really popularized by a 1908 play of the same name, which you see a playbill of on the right, but really current for decades before then, as a more positive, if as we can now see, desperately condescending, standing against what we might consider any kind of authentic pluralism. But it had been present, and it was understood to be optimistic, right? So this sort of Americanized sort of version of Lady Liberty is using the spoon of equal rights to stir all of these immigrants in, and the caption is the mortar of assimilation. The idea was assimilation, right? And the one element that won't mix. And what this particular cartoon critiques is the angry, drunken, violent Irishman, who was understood at the time in many quarters to be not assimilable, in large part because of Catholicism. It's the Irish here, it's 1889 in this cartoon, who just won't mix in. And the melting pot ideal was part of a larger cultural momentum that was, in its own mind, positively, idealistically inclined to understand America as a land of promise, a land of optimism, of liberty and opportunity for all those abroad living under the oppressive thumb of one or another old world totalitarianism. And there's no better emblem, no better symbol of this central myth than the Statue of Liberty. And we'll close by looking at this. What you see here are a number of images. The statue actually was taken into pieces and moved here. It's just great to sort of see that, how big the face is in comparison to a person, how big the feet are in comparison to a person. And all the pieces kind of went on tour, became their own pilgrimage sites for Americans that had spent some time in Paris first. You see the base being constructed there, and then the unveiling, and there you have it on its, in the harbor. So the Statue of Liberty Enlightening the World is its title. It was a gift to the U.S. from the people of France, and it was a gift intended not to celebrate America's openness to immigration. That's not what the intention was. It was a gift intended to celebrate the Union victory in the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. Hence the broken shackles at Lady Liberty's feet. This is a part of the history that the Statue of Liberty Museum is only now starting to remind us of. Almost all of the images that you'll see here are taken from the National Park Service's website. That's a great website, a wealth of narrative and pictures for all the parks. You check it out. Now, in France, the statue was first proposed by Edward de la Bouillière, pictured bottom right, and it was sculpted by Auguste Bartholdi, other two pictures in his studio. And the symbol garnered pretty immediate mythic weight, though less so for the African American community whose newfound liberty it was initially meant to celebrate. but who didn't experience that liberty in a direct social, physical, or economic way, and so who really didn't resonate with this image in the kind of optimistic, idealistic way in which it was intended. But the mythic weight did accrue, um, and pretty quickly attached itself directly to immigrants, especially to those coming through New York Harbor. You can see that it's played on to sell war bonds later, right? Remember your first thrill of American liberty. This coming in on a boat and seeing this welcoming statue. Now, it wasn't on the bottom left. You can see if those of you who have seen Godfather Part 2. This emblematic image shows up in that American saga as well. It really developed a sense of concrete mythic value for immigration into New York Harbor, but it's also, bottom right, this is from 1890, it's also used as an emblem of anti-immigration right from the beginning. So the caption at the bottom of this one, the statue is kind of, fearfully, scrunching up and a little bit scared of this boat dumping more people on her island, right? And it's called the Proposed Emigrant Dumping Site. That's emigrant with an E, not immigrant with an I. So this cartoon doesn't even accept that those people have gotten here or are coming here. It's somebody coming from somewhere else. The word itself says we have not, right? With an E, emigrant means leaving from somewhere. With an I, it means coming to somewhere. This cartoon doesn't even accept their entry into America and just calls this a dumping site. Now, between 1886 and 1924, a little bit bigger than the time period we're looking at, but about 14 million immigrants entered through New York, and that's sort of what you see pictured here. The immigration processing station at Ellis Island opened in 1892. In 1886, the statue was dedicated, and to raise money to pay for the massive pedestal, what we saw being constructed in the last image, an auction was held of art and poetry, and this is where Emma Lazarus enters our story. She submitted the new Colossus to that auction. It was published in Pulitzer's New York World that year. We'll come back to him. But it was cast in bronze and affixed to the base in 1903, a decade and a half after Lazarus's own early death. Now, the poem is a sonnet, and it refers to the old Colossus, a statue that likely straddled the entry to the harbor of Rhodes. These are some artist renderings, some guesses at what it might have looked like. It's no longer extant. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but we do know that the old Colossus signified empire, strength, power, and in this poem, that style of power is rejected in favor of a great universalistic, democratic impulse that was overwhelmingly welcoming in tone. This is a poem that contextualizes the statue itself primarily in terms of immigration and gives the statue a voice that links liberty indissolubly to humanitarian justice, in that liberty, to be liberty, must welcome the homeless, the tempest-tossed. Now, we've seen that the time when this was written and cast in bronze, this was also a time of massive immigration, of laws limiting that immigration, and of strong public denunciation of the increasing numbers from increasingly non-Western European places. Both were real impulses, and both remain real aspects of the living myths of America. They contradict one another. The symbol can be used to fit both, and it has been. Political cartoons today use the weighty symbolic value, the weighty mythic nature of the symbol of the Statue of Liberty to critique American characteristics, what are seen to be deviations from the individualistic, free, self-determined, and rugged qualities made central through the frontier. So the upper left, you have the new Colossus, or Obesity Appalling the World, which is a critique of, this is fast food nation, a critique of America's food habits. Upper right, keep your tired, poor, huddled masses. Really, all I want is cheap labor, and that's just this sort of entitlement. Bottom left, this is a really, stereotyped vision of the GOP. Give me your rested, your rich, your coddled hedge funders yearning to be tax-free. And bottom right, this is a critique of the increasing surveillance state that Americans have accepted since 9/11. The little kid says, gosh, I swear she used to have a torch of some kind, and what she's got now are surveillance mechanisms. Maybe we shouldn't Google anything, says his mom, grandma, whoever that is. So it is often used in political cartoons to critique fundamental American characteristics, also used more explicitly to critique America's immigration practices and policies from both sides still, right? Bottom left, too, are very clearly pro-immigration and showing the ways, using the Statue of Liberty to suggest that contemporary immigration policies and cultural approach to immigrants are hypocritical, right? No foreigners, go home immigrants, and you've got this sort of, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to see it statue, and then send her back, she's not white, she's from another country, right? And you've got this sort of very sad statue. And the upper image, the upper left image, is coming from exactly the other side, 3 million illegal aliens per year, and it's called a tsunami, and you've got the statue saying, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're, oh dear. I don't think dear is what she's saying, but this is the notion that I think what's represented here is that, you know, the ideals of American liberty and welcomeness to immigrants are themselves being overwhelmed by what are shown to be maybe, I don't know, overreaching claims. And the bottom is actually sort of ripped from the headlines, bottom right. In 2019, the acting director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ken Cuccinelli, used the poem in a briefing on the new immigration policy of the Trump administration, saying, quote, give me your tired, your poor, who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge. The statue remains a symbol for many more open immigration policies and perspectives. You know, we contradict ourselves. We continue to do this. Walt Whitman, writing Leaves of Grass during the latter half of the 19th century and singing the Song of America, asked in that poem, you know, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am vast. I contain multitudes. It was true then, you know, when the so-called American character privileging struggle and resilience and democracy was built on genocide, when America's frontier closed and America began to close its borders, while also granting to futurity this powerful symbol of openness, of welcome, of opportunity. And it's true now. That's democracy, right? What you see at the right side of the screen is, you know, several instances of street art that have used the image of the Statue of Liberty, thoroughly recognizable the world over, to comment in various ways on, you know, the American social practices, American political self-understanding. We continue to contradict ourselves. We continue to use this image in various ways, and that's, you know, that's democracy. Like I said, my only answer to it is get involved, right? Throw your weight in. That's the nature of democracy. Everyone will not agree. That will not happen. But without civic engagement on the level of the individual, again, the measure of value will be power, and power almost always, you know, translates into money at this point. So next time we'll look at the Spanish-American War proper and at how, with that war, the frontier that was taken during the Mexican-American War and closed in 1890 was extended to the scale of empire. And we'll look at how Theodore Roosevelt and yellow journalism helped to make that happen.